Good morning. My name is Ceema Samimi-Luu, and I'm here to talk to you today about permanent exclusions in public housing. But before I get into that, I'm going to ask you to role play a little bit with me. So if you could please close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine that you are a public housing resident. You moved into NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, when you were just 7 years old. You've lived in your unit for over 30 years, and you've seen a lot of changes in NYCHA housing, but you're still proud to call yourself a resident of public housing. When your parents passed away, you took over the lease to the apartment and became the primary tenant. And you currently live there with your 3 children. Your oldest son, who is 16 years old, helps you take care of your younger children while you're away at work. One day, you come home and find a notice stating that your son is being permanently excluded and you must appear at the NYCHA offices downtown for a meeting. Permanently excluded? You don't even know what this means. You go to the meeting and it turns out that your son's trespassing arrest from 3 months ago, which was subsequently dismissed, triggered the proceeding. You have the choice of either filling out a form stating that you will never allow your son to return to your home again, or taking the issue to a hearing. However, if you go to the hearing and lose, your whole family could be evicted from your apartment. Now, permanent exclusion is not local to New York City. It was created by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in the late 1990s. And what HUD stated was that anyone who was on the Lifetime Sex Offender Registry or who was convicted of the manufacture of methamphetamine in public housing had to be permanently excluded or permanently removed from public housing. So knowing this, you might think that the story I told you earlier was a little extreme. However, stories like this were being told over and over again to advocates, attorneys, and reentry service providers. As this community spoke to each other, they started noticing some patterns in these stories. And it turns out that HUD also had said that local public housing authorities could use their discretion in using permanent exclusions how they thought necessary. So these stories are actually not that uncommon. And in fact, as advocates, attorneys, and reentry service providers started hearing these stories, they began to talk, and they began to notice some patterns. They formed a working group on permanent exclusion, which was housed at the Prisoner Reentry Institute at John Jay College, where I was placed as a TAL Policy Advocacy Fellow. The questions that the working group wanted to answer were things like, how many people were excluded every year? Were they always permanent? Why were people being excluded? How old were they? 2 issues that got particular attention was the fact that there seemed to be no minimum age for exclusions. This means that children and juveniles could be removed from their homes forever. Another issue was that even if an arrest was dismissed, the exclusion could still take place. And it didn't seem fair that when the criminal justice system didn't think a punishment was necessary, the housing system did. So what was my role in all of this? Well, I assisted with coordinating meetings and the logistical side of things. I also helped organize tenant engagement forums and get input from NYCHA residents. And in order to help the working group better understand and address the issue, I created a database. Now, NYCHA likes to keep their data private. So what I did was I looked at public records. The NYCHA Journal, which is its resident newsletter, publishes the names and addresses of everyone who's been permanently excluded. So I collected all of that data from 2005 to 2013, and I took a look at the numbers. And what the numbers told me was that 3,024 people had been excluded in that time frame. The exclusion numbers didn't make a lot of sense. For instance, Manhattan has the most public housing residents. However, for every year I looked at, Brooklyn had the most exclusions. Brooklyn always had the most exclusions, but Manhattan has the most residents. Also, the larger developments did not necessarily have the most number of exclusions. It varied borough to borough year by year. Also, in every borough, there was no pattern or correlation to how many people were excluded and the size of each NYCHA development, meaning larger developments didn't necessarily have the most exclusions, and smaller developments sometimes had more. It varied year by year. 2010 was the peak year for exclusions at over 500, but just 2 years later, in 2012, it was 186. So the data really raised a lot more questions than it answered. We still didn't know how many people were being excluded under the age of 18, if they were being incarcerated after their exclusion, if more than one person was being excluded for one incident or from the same family. It was really difficult to tell. So the question still stands. Is NYCHA using permanent exclusions as it should be to keep communities safe, drug manufacturers and sex offenders away from families? Or is it being used too broadly as a policy? We don't know. The working group is currently meeting with NYCHA to try to get answers to this question and to see if it's possible to make changes to the policy. Thank you.